Okay, good afternoon everybody. It's great to see you all today and welcome to the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. Today's event is to mark 150 years of St Matthew's Church, Shankill, and we're also launching the exhibition for the second time, I should say. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to representatives from the Greater Shankill Partnership, members of St Matthew's Parish Church, Professor Owen Purdy, Vice Chancellor of Queen's Ian Greer, and anybody else who I haven't covered from the general public. Before I invite Ian to speak, just want to give a few housekeeping announcements. There's no fire alarms arranged, so in the event there's an alarm, it's the real thing. So we will evacuate, cross the road, Queen's Road, and assemble at the apartment blocks just on the other side. This area is also a pay and display area, so if anybody's parked outside, we just encourage you to pay and display in case it's never good when some of our hosts get camped. Toilets are in the atrium. I should also note there's a loop system for those who are hard of hearing. Now, this exhibition was a co-creation. It was done in conjunction with Queen's University and PRONI. I'm a former alumni of Queen's, so I always take great pleasure in doing things which work with Queen's and celebrate Queen's. I should also say PRONI is a national archive, and even though we operate with big record series, I think we operate at our best when we are involved with communities and with local groups, and I think that's where we make our best impact. So I'm going to say nothing else except that it's my pleasure to invite Ian to come and say a few words. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here and to share this celebration with you, which marks the 150th anniversary of St Matthew's Church in Shankill Parish, which I understand is the oldest parish in Belfast. Not quite as old as Queen's, but I think we're both in the same league. We were 175 years old the other year, and looking forward to many years ahead and hopefully many years together with collaborations like this. So as you've already heard, there was a previous exhibition and today's event builds on that. I'm told that there was an important bronze, part of a bishop's crozier that was discovered here, and that was part of that exhibition. And I guess the importance of that is emphasised by the fact that that's normally housed in the National Museum of Ireland. And that's a great testament to the type of event, the type of work that's going on here. And of course, from a university perspective, I'm really delighted that we've got Queen's Professoriate, Queen's students, Queen's University involved with a partnership like this, working in collaboration with PRONI, the Greater Shankill Children and Young People Zone, and of course the people of St Matthew's. This is a great story for us all, and a great story that can be told, kept and curated by PRONI. So Queen's and St Matthew's have been part of the fabric of this city for almost 2 centuries, shaping the lives of many people as they went. And at Queen's we share a motto with the city of Belfast. I won't give you it in Latin, but in English it says, "What shall we give back in return for so much?" And for us that means the university's social charter. It's our commitment of giving back to society. It's the foundation in which we strive to build a better place, a better economy, a better life for our people. So I'm very proud that Queen's plays a great role in this place. And we put an immense value in the collaboration that we see today between the groups of people who've come together to make this such a success. We've got a new strategy, Strategy 2030, and that impact on place, transforming people's lives, is critically important, whether it's through social change or economic growth. And it's great to work in partnership with the likes of Jackie's group in the Greater Shankill Young People Zone, which I think dates back to 2015 in terms of our partnership, and we're committed to seeing that going forward. And of course, you're talking about being an alumnus of Queen's. Jackie also is an honorary graduate of Queen's. We don't let people forget that, because one day we have to call on you for a favour. And of course I'm delighted that both St Matthew's and PRONI are also partners here. That's a really important, a really strong collaboration. And this exhibition is part of a major new community-based project which, as I've said, brought together archaeologists and historians from Queen's and of course the people of Greater Shankill. We want to work across these groups with local schools, with local communities and make a real difference. And I was hearing that in fact at the first exhibition in the church there was lots of children involved attending and enjoying that event. So I'm really delighted that the launch today really does mark the start of a strand of a great new project, the creation of the Oral History Archive, which PRONI will house, which I think is a great step forward in making sure that that archive is accessible and curated long into the future. As you know, it's been developed by people in Queen's, many of whom are with us today, and of course the people of the Shankill, with that support from PRONI. So this is a really exciting development that will allow the people of Belfast to explore this in the years ahead. And I commend to you my colleagues from Queen's University, particularly Professor Alwyn Purdue, Sam Guthrie, and of course the MA students, some of whom I think are here today. I wish you much continued success as you create this valuable resource, and I hope that it continues long into the future, not just with the resource creation, but also with the partnership. Thank you very much.
And I'd like to invite Jackie, our fantastic, and also say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks to the Public Records Office for hosting us today. It is very significant, and also to the Vice-Chancellor for his kind words. The partnership with Queen's and the Shankill is very significant for us and is creating regeneration opportunities in the area that we would never have dreamt of 10 or 20 years ago. So it's very significant, and the ongoing partnership is so welcome. And today's an expression of that in terms of St Matthew's, and thank you St Matthew's again for being here. And I think the significant thing is that the 150th of St Matthew's anniversary has become a bridgehead into this ongoing work here now, because with Queen's, with Alwyn, Professor Purdue, with the Department of Archaeology, it's only one aspect of the partnership with Queen's actually, but what's going to happen here as a result of today and the ongoing work of collecting the oral history of the Shankill and the archaeological history and story of the heritage, the industrial heritage that we have, is very, very important, not least around Shankill Graveyard, which was the site of the original St Matthew's, which I myself have a connection to, not current I might say, but apart from the exhibition, but my grandmother was a member of St Matthew's, was born in 1871, so was either baptised in the old church in Shankill Graveyard or one of the first in the new church, if the family held her back for a year to baptise. I don't know, maybe they did. But she came from Leopold Street, and well, originally from Springfield Village actually, and then Leopold Street. So there's a great connection that so many people, and we've got the Shankill Area Social History Group representatives here today, a great story around St Matthew's and the whole of the Shankill. And I think it's fitting that it just stop for a moment to say that, you know, the death of May Blood overnight, you know, is just a reinforcement of why we need to do what we are doing. You know, May was born in Roden Street. She left there in 1969 during the worst of the Troubles. She came to live in Spring Martin and was adopted as a daughter of the Shankill. But from Roden Street, she was that generation which the last of it we need to capture. You know, she worked in Blackstaff Linen Mill on the Springfield Road. That was what gave her entry to the rest of her life, because she became a trade union, Transport and General Workers Union representative in that linen mill, and rose to become an officer in that trade union in the city centre, and a very active person in it, and then moved from that into community work in Spring Martin, the Black Mountain Action Group, Tenants Association there, and then something that became the love of her life, and there was two things in her later life that were central to what she did. One was the early years project on the Shankill, which is now Sure Start. And from day one, from that was conceived and the funding from the European Union came through under the Urban One initiative, she was chair of the committee that ran the Sure Start and the Early Years project, which is really about investing in the coming generation, and an amazing story there in its own right. But then integrated education was something that she committed herself to totally, and if I was thinking of a word to describe me, it would be stalwart. Whatever she committed to totally. And she committed herself to that, and then, you know, was elevated to the House of Lords. What a story, from Roden Street, Blackstaff Mill to the House of Lords, where she was massively appreciated, and where she took her seat initially on the cross benches and then on the Labour benches. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning all this is that she deserves to be mentioned today, but also she epitomises what we need to catch on the Shankill, that story. The Labour history on the Shankill, very often forgotten in this day and age, but such a strong tradition that needs recorded and remembered, and may epitomise so much about life on the Shankill. Many people were surprised she wasn't actually a Shankill Road woman, that she was adopted in the Shankill in 1969, but she became one, and we're forever, ever grateful for the contribution that she made. And that's why I think I had prepared something else, but I think it was worth diverting into that tribute to May today, and the right thing to do, not only because of May obviously, but because in a way her voice is telling us something today, which is to do this, to collect the oral history of the Shankill, to look at what we have historically. But not just that, May was never anyone closed into the past. It was about taking it forward, as evidenced by our commitment to children and young people in our Early Years project and Sure Start in the Shankill, and in her love of integrated education. She will be missed, and I think she provides us with an inspiration today to make sure that what we want to do does happen. So thanks very much, Stephen.
I'd now like to invite Janet Hancock to say a few words on behalf of PRONI.
Good afternoon, and just following on from Jackie's comments, to acknowledge that very sad news, which I hadn't heard, of the passing of Baroness May Blood. I'm going to be very brief. I'm conscious I'm between everybody and their lunch here. But just to say that we were really delighted when Olwen first approached us about partnering in this exhibition. It's not our first partnership with Olwen and Queen's, exploring particularly Belfast history. We did an exhibition called Surviving the City a number of years ago, and I was just thinking about this is very much a sort of a microcosm of that, and a deep dive into a particular part of Belfast, which I think is a really nice follow-on. It's an opportunity for PRONI to highlight a small sample of the records we hold in our extensive archive, which extends to around 3 million records, many of which are useful for helping people explore their family and local history, as has been touched on. The connection to those family connections, working connections, you know, like, to put that in layman's term, records are about people and place, and communities are about people and place, and it's really the records that allow people as a catalyst to start maybe thinking about those and talking about those, and certainly the oral recordings, using some of this historical material and some of that reminiscence as a springboard to start sort of bringing some of those stories to life. I would invite, it's great to see the social history group of members, some of whom are here, as well as just members of the general community. And just to reiterate what Stephen said, you're very welcome here today, but you're very welcome here every day that we're open. This is the public record office, and the clue is very much in the title. We want people to come in and use the resources we have here. It's a very simple process. You register as a PRONI visitor. We have staff here who are on hand at our help desk to help you get started with exploring your own connections into both Shankill and other elements of past, our family past, and our local history. Many people in their busy schedules don't always have time to do that. We have a fantastic website, lots of resources from this particular angle. We have street directories, we have an historical maps viewer, so I'd really urge people to sort of reach around and use those resources and sort of bring your own personal connections to life with any part of your own sort of community and family memory. This type of work very much ties in with the work that PRONI does in relation to our setting as part of the Department for Communities, which is really about widening access and encouraging people to use the resources that we have. And we've been very much working over the last number of years to increase our opportunities for community level partnerships and to work with people on the ground and to highlight how archives are relevant not just to the past and not just to the present, but also the sort of future, that idea of understanding where we've come from. I think we're very lucky here. We get a lot of overseas visitors through the massive Irish diaspora. People from Northern Ireland and all over Ireland come back here to touch base with their roots, and I think we take for granted how tied into our roots we actually are here, and it's a great privilege. So without further ado, I'll sort of let you all go and have a bite to eat, invite everybody to have a look at the exhibition, have a bite of lunch, and after that we're going to be having a few more detailed talks after our lunch break. So thank you.
Okay, well thank you all again so much for coming. It's just been a lovely day. It's been so nice to have old friends from St Matthew's here and see them again, and just have this opportunity to bring together PRONI and the people from St Matthew's and the wider Shankill, and then my friends and colleagues at Queen's as well. It's so exciting to launch the exhibition that looks at the history of St Matthew's Parish. Originally curated, as we mentioned earlier, to mark the 150th anniversary of the church building, and we are delighted now that it's come to the Public Record Office. It's lovely that it's going to be housed here for a while for the wider public to see and to explore themselves. For those of you who are interested, I think there are a few documents relating to St Matthew's that are made available in the reading room, and later on, if you want to wander up and have a look at those, you'd be welcome to. But the exhibition, while it's exciting and it marks in many ways sort of the culmination of some work, it's also a taster. It's the beginning, and it's that beginning I want to think about now for a minute. It represents the early beginnings of a much bigger, more ambitious project that a few of us are talking about and planning at the moment. I'll come back to that later, but also it offers just the tiniest snapshot of the very rich history of Shankill Parish. As the first panel in the exhibition shows, it has an extremely long and illustrious history, something that is evidenced in the material culture connected with the parish and with St Matthew's. So anyone familiar with the church will know the Ballon stone that sits outside it, and the stones, I know there's lots of stories about what that was used for in the past, but those stones are very clearly connected with the medieval period, and therefore very much places Shankill Parish, the oldest parish in Belfast, in that very early period indeed. And of course, there were the fragments of the Bishop's crozier that were discovered in Shankill Graveyard and have been held by the National Library of Ireland, and again, as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned earlier, were very kindly given us on a loan for the exhibition. That was quite an incredible sight, because the Church of Ireland also loaned a whole bunch of other croziers, so there's this whole crozier collection in the middle. It also sparked conversations about Elgin marbles and restitution. We'll not go there. So there's a very, very long history that we only know fragments of, largely through the work of archaeologists. But also looking at more modern times, there's a really rich social history of the area. The stories of people who loved and worked and played and laughed, who loved and cried in those houses and the streets around St Matthew's. And this is something that the work on the exhibition has begun to uncover. But again, it's just the very early beginnings. There's so much more work to be done. So for the next half hour or so, I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by two colleagues from Queen's, an archaeologist and a historian and former student on our MA in Public History programme. And they're going to introduce us to a little bit more of that history and tell us the stories behind the exhibition. So first up, we've got Rory O'Boyle. Rory is an excavation director with the Centre of Community Archaeology, Archaeology and Paleontology at Queen's University. He's a founder, member and chair of the Irish Post-Medieval Archaeology Group. He sat on the board of Archaeologists of Ireland and was president of the Ulster Archaeological Society from 2016 all the way through to 2022. That was some going. And he's directed and worked on a large number of excavations across Ireland, including work on Viking Age Ireland, the archaeology of Irish towns, something I'm particularly interested in hearing about, and so on. And among many of his publications are books on the archaeology of Carrickfergus, Belfast and Londonderry. Beneath our feet, the work in Belfast, Rory, I thought was absolutely fascinating. I love it. It sits proudly in my bookshelf. So I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more now. Thank you very much, Rory. Over to you.
Thanks, Alma. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for asking me to speak. I was very honoured because of all the years I've worked in archaeology. I've worked 40 years on excavations. I did my training dig at Queen's in 1982, and I've been directing excavations since 1991. And the way the cards have fallen, I've spent most of my archaeological career, or much of it, working in town. So I've worked in Dublin, I've worked in Limerick for several years, in Sligo and in Belfast, and I worked on the first ever excavation in the centre of Belfast in 1983 at Browns and Normans in the city centre under Nick Brannan. About 10 years ago I was asked by Belfast City Council and the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, now HED, to actually write a book on the archaeology of Belfast because there wasn't one. And I had done an article in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology talking about excavations in Belfast, and I googled out of curiosity history of Belfast, archaeology of Belfast, and I was getting that Belfast has a 200-year-old history. And the problem was that there's actually 10,000 years of history in and around Belfast, but the archaeologists, I suppose, weren't telling people. And so I was asked to write the book, and I also developed a walk with Dr. James O'Neill around the centre of town, giving an idea of what had been there, and that's why it was called Hidden History Below Our Feet. So it's not hard to understand why people don't have a sense of the antiquity of Belfast. This is the oldest standing building in Belfast city centre, Clifton House, close to where I went to school, and it's only about 250 years old. And you start telling people that Belfast actually had 3 castles, and it had medieval churches, early Christian churches such as at Shankill, that had town defences in the 1640s. But you can't see any of these now. So unlike Carrickfergus, which is 17th century town walls, medieval churches, medieval castles, I suppose people, if you don't see the antiquity, the archaeology in a place, it's very hard to get a grip with it. So one of the whole ideas behind the book was to tell people about the archaeology and the tours as well. So what about Belfast? Well, a lot of it is to do with the rivers, people and rivers. So settlement came to Belfast late. The Anglo-Normans founded the first version of Belfast, I suppose, around 1200. However, there were people living in the hills around Belfast for thousands of years, from the Mesolithic period onwards, from about 8000 BC. The problem was that they couldn't live in what's now Belfast city centre because 3 main rivers run through it, the Farset, the Lagan and the Blackstaff or Owenvara, and the city centre is only 6 metres above sea level and prone to flooding. But because the Lagan divides what's now County Down, County Antrim, it was always an important place. There have been Bronze Age swords found near the Queen's Bridge. It was a very important crossing point. And in fact, our first reference to Belfast is a battle at the first at the river in the 660s. So the rivers play a very important part in Belfast history and in the area of the Shankill. The problem now is that so many of the rivers have been culverted. So in the city centre you can't see the River Farset, but the whole reason that High Street is bevelled, or chamfered, is that the Farset runs under it. Blackstaff has been changed. The line of the Blackstaff and it runs through Victoria Square. So people don't get an idea of how important the rivers were, and obviously all the tributaries down from the Antrim Plateau as well. In terms of the Shankill, as far as it runs very close to the graveyard, and there's one of Hogg's photographs. And again, and again, and again. And you can just about see it if you stand looking over into the lagoon where it actually disgorges. So the rivers have always been very important in early Christian times, in medieval times, and then more latterly in the 19th century with industry as well. This gives you a cross-section by S. Evans, showing basically the mountains either side of the lagoon, and let's see, back. Shankill Church is here. Church. It gives you an idea of the topography. But just because you couldn't settle in the city centre, just because there wasn't settlement until about 1200 AD, didn't mean that people weren't living in and around all these areas in Belfast. So there's Mesolithic Belfast looking in from the loch. County Down, George Best Airport, we have evidence of Mesolithic activity from about 8000 BC. In and around, I suppose, the Ormer Bridge. And the Ormer Bridge and the Malone, what we call the Malone Ridge, from essentially the bottom of Lisburn Road, from Ormer Bridge upwards, you have well-drained gravels, and it runs all the way to the Giant Spring. It means your wooden houses wouldn't rot. So settlement tends to, in the Mesolithic period, along the rivers, but also on well-drained gravels. The earliest people who came about 8000 BC were hunter-gatherers, and we have some evidence of their flint tools. So these are the only things that survive. New settlers came about 4000 BC, 6000 years ago, and looking in from the loch again, up at the top of the Giant Spring, we have a centre car array, and a variety of archaeological evidence for settlement. None, however, at Shankill yet, but all around Belfast in the higher areas. I carried out an excavation at Squires Hill, close to the origins of the Forest River in 2016, and we found the remains, those are the foundations of a building, and we've got more than 2,000 pieces of chipped flint from the early Neolithic period, and as far as I'm aware, this is the earliest building found at Belfast. So we have this evidence up in the hills, up on the high ground. Malone hoard, you've probably all seen of these in the Ulster Museum, internationally important. Porcellanite axes, mined up in County Antrim, found on the Malone Road, and see there are absolutely astonishing artefacts, twice the size that a functional axe would have been used, and again given to someone presumably as a gift back 6,000 years ago. As we go into the Bronze Age, the end of the Neolithic Bronze Age, about 4000 BC, we have standing stones. We're not quite sure what these are, whether they're grave markers, whether they're territory markers. There's a series of these again up on the high ground above what would be towards the centre of Belfast, and there's Raths. We get into the Christian period, and the Christian period is very important for us because if people have arrived in Ireland 8000 BC and Christianity arrives in 500 AD, the Christian monks bring writing. So we've only had written descriptions of places and people and activities for 1500 years. For the other 8,500 years of development, people living in and around Belfast, our only evidence is archaeology. So that's one of the reasons people ask why is archaeology important, because they say it is our only evidence for so much of that time. And then when you get into the writing, into the Irish annals and the Anglo-Norman annals, they tend to describe the great and the good. So archaeology is a great leveller because it tells you about the everyday life of ordinary people on sites. And we would find that digging buildings, 17th century buildings, for example, in the centre of Belfast. There's up at Ballyagig and Rath, excavated by Dr. Harry Welsh. So we've all these Christian settlements in and around Belfast, on both sides of the loch, on the County Antrim side, on the hills and the slopes of the Antrim Plateau, There were a whole bunch up near Malone and the Antrim Road. And so this was the settlement, the farm settlement, where ordinary people lived from about the 7th, 8th century onwards. Those people needed to grind corn, so they needed mills, and this is where the rivers come in again. And this was what we call a horizontal mill for grinding corn. This was found on the Springfield Road in 1930. And what you're seeing is basically the foundation frame. This is the most important part. This is the flue that the water comes in, and they're actually exploiting the rivers that run down from the Belfast Hills. And this is how it works. So the water runs through this flue, turns a wooden panel. On the first floor you have 2 millstones. You put in your grain, and it's actually self-grinding. So there was one of those on the Springfield Road, and we have the photograph. But there was another one found down here at Dover Street in the 1920s. There's a written description of it, same sort of framework, same sort of flue. So they were using, down at Dover Street, at the bottom of Shankill, they were using one of these horizontal mills for grinding corn for making bread. And this is, you're probably aware of this, is from the Historic Environment Map Viewer, which is a fantastic free resource. If you haven't used it before, it's a bit like, I suppose, AA Route Finder. So you click on it, and it gives you a map of Northern Ireland, and you can zoom in. And I've cropped it out, but on the top right-hand side of the screen, there's a key, and it tells you monuments, heritage sites, industrial archaeology, gardens, etc. And you can click them on and off. The archaeological monuments on the heritage monuments as here are in green. And for our purposes, that site, or that early Christian horizontal mill, is one of the most important sites. And when you click on it, this is what comes up. It gives you a basic information, and if you click on then link to the Northern Ireland Sites and Monuments database, it gives you more information. For our purposes as well, the most important site, one of the most important sites, certainly the most important early site, the Christian site in Belfast, and one of the most important archaeological sites in Belfast is Shankill Graveyard. And I'll talk about it again at the end, but basically if people have asked me, of the hotspots you would like to excavate in Belfast, I mean, of the 2 or 3, this is one of the top ones because there's so much of early Belfast history in this, and it also explains why the centre of town, which is later, basically more history at Shankill Graveyard, it's kind of older than what we regard than an actual settlement in the city centre itself. So this would be definitely one of the hotspots. So we've heard about the Bull story. This is from an article in the Ulster Journal of Archaeology in 1894, description of the parish of Shankill, and at that stage the Bull stone is still in Shankill Churchyard or Shankill Graveyard. Of course it subsequently moves up to St Matthew's Church, and I was very pleased to be allowed to photograph this and to go around Shankill Graveyard. When I was writing my book, I went around with a photographer some of you might remember called Gail Pollock, who took a lot of the photographs of archaeological sites in Northern Ireland, absolutely stunning photographs for decades. She's now retired and still involved in archaeology. But this Bull stone, we're not sure what Bull stones were used for, possibly for like holy water fonts, possibly for other kind of church rituals, but they are diagnostic archaeologists of the early church, the early Christian church before the time of the Normans. So to have this Bull stone very close to where the original early Christian medieval church was at Shankill is a lovely continuity. The archaeologists, the fact that it hasn't gone into a museum, it's actually very close to the point where it was used 1,000 years ago, is very important to us, so it's lovely to see it there. We've talked about the crozier again. The importance of this, again, just showing how the eminence and the status of and the importance of the church at Shankill. Why was there a church actually on the Shankill Road? Well, part of the reason was, and part of the reason that the Normans we're going a few hundred years later. One of the reasons the Normans kind of founded Belfast was it guarded the crossing of the Lagan between County Antrim and County Down. And you have roads automatically then coming out of that, one of which on the County Down side is essentially the Newtonards Road. And the road that develops into the Shankill Road was probably the road that went up to Antrim, so it was on one of the main thoroughfares. It was also close to the rivers, the River Farset, that could be exploited for things like grinding corn. So that's probably the reason why the early church was built. The Anglo-Normans come at the end of the 12th century, and they found what is the first version of Belfast in Belfast city centre. We're not exactly sure when. There's a reference to a castle in the reign of Henry III in 1262. And we have other documentary references. The castle was attacked and captured by Edward Bruce when he invaded Ireland between 1315 and 1318. But essentially, what we think of as medieval Belfast is this area between where it says chapel there is St George's Church, and we'll talk about it. It was known as the Cappella de Vado, the chapel of the fort. It succeeded the Ecclesia Alba, the White Church at Shankill during the medieval period. Possible site of the castle is in Castle Place. Further on up to Millfield, there's a mill. You know, there's a mill as well. And archaeologists think that the medieval core of Belfast ran between the River Farset, which is now under High Street, probably the line down to the site of the fortress to Ann Street, and rounded to the east by the Lagan, and maybe another ditch bringing in water. But there was medieval material found up near Castle Street, and it's possible, and also the medieval settlement extended up to the higher ground up around there as well, up towards Millfield. But this was our first settlement at Belfast. When the Farset was reculverted, they found burials in Castle Place and along High Street, close to the Chapel of the Fort. I'm not going to go too much into the archaeology of Belfast. I will come back to Shankill shortly. But some of the artefacts that have been found in excavations include this beautiful copper or lead alloy brooch, which is on display in the Ulster Museum. Medieval pottery has been found in excavations in the centre of town as well. And the remains of a post and bottle breakwater under the kitchen bar, the old kitchen bar, and there was medieval pottery found in the bank that supported that. It was probably a quayside, but well, basically boats coming up the Lagan moored at, so it was one side of the medieval settlement at Belfast. So we have archaeological evidence, some structures, some pottery, some skeletons. We still don't have any archaeological evidence so far for the castle, and the first of the castles, which is around Corn Market. And Belfast street names pretty much tell you what it is in the town. So we have loads of castle places, castle streets, all leading towards the castles. We haven't had a chance to excavate the Cappella de Vado, the Chapel of the Fort, which is under St George's, which is still a functioning church. So we haven't had a chance yet to excavate these important medieval buildings, and we haven't had a chance yet to excavate at Shankill Graveyard, or the park. That would be lovely, because I'm sure we would find stuff there. So the earliest reference to the Shankill Church is contained within a papal taxation of 1306. And this records that the Ecclesia Alba, or the White Church, and other dependent chapels, one of which was known as the Cappella de Vado, the Chapel of the Fort, and that's what the Normans knew Belfast as, Belfast city centre, their settlement. They called it the Fort. It was almost like a direct translation of Farset, the Irish Fort. And it was only really when the Clandy boy O'Neill's founded the second version of Belfast in the 15th and 16th century that we get Belfast being called Belfastia. So the Normans called it the Fort. So the Cappella de Vado was the Chapel of the Fort. The White Church, the church on the Shankill, the Cappella de Vado, was the parish church for the area, which included the Anglo-Norman manor of Leford, Belfast, and was almost certainly located at the site of the old graveyard at Shankill, and it's about 2 kilometres west of the city centre. we have no historical evidence, nothing in the documents to indicate that the Ecclesia Alba, the White Church, was a pre-Norman foundation. However, the fact that we have the crozier, the fact that the bull on stone is there, and there's an unpublished excavation from 1959. They did work at the entrance to the graveyard, and there's a mound of stones just inside the gate, and it was supervised by the famous archaeologist Dudley Waterman, and they hoped they might have found the foundations of a stone church, but it turned out, I think, that it was to do with a possible cholera pit from the 1840s. But during that excavation, they found what we call Suterian pottery, that's pottery from the 7th to the 12th century, pre-Norman unglazed pottery, and they also found the remains of ironworking, all of which are consistent with early Christian churches. So if you put those along with the bull on stone and the crozier, it all suggests that there was a pre-Norman, important pre-Norman church at Shankill. It's uncertain what status the site at Shankill had prior to the 12th century reform of the church that led to the creation of parishes without a territorially based diocesan structure. It has been pointed out by archaeologists and historians that the name White Church is often attributed to early stone built churches because of the whitewash that was used on their walls. But we believe it also was a region where stone built churches remained in the minority until at least 1200 AD, the coming of the Normans. So therefore any pre-Norman church present at the site, contemporary with the crozier and the bull on stone and the pottery, was probably made of wood, wattle and turf. So that's what we would be looking for that early church. So it is listed as the main church in the medieval period. Other medieval material has been found. I was just actually looking for another reference about actually the castle of Corn O'Neill for a lecture I was giving, and just below it I came across this. This year, the sexton of Shankill, the old parish church of Belfast, when making a grave, found a penny of King John, and coins have been discovered at various times in this place. So we see the continuity of the church throughout this period. But it would appear that at some point in the medieval period, the Capella di Vado, the chapel of the Forge, supersedes the church at Shankill as the parish church, and in fact it is described as in the possession of the Benedictine Cathedral Priory of St Patrick in 1552, and it's actually the church at Shankill is also described as ruinous in the calendar patent rolls for 1604. And again, like the earlier church, we've no evidence of the medieval church that may have stood at Shankill, and that remains to be found. There's a map of Belfast Lough, and all it shows is a castle. And in 1333, the Anglo-Norman settlement in Ulster imploded. There was civil war amongst the Normans. The resident Earl de Burgh was killed by his own barons, and much of the earldom in Ulster was destroyed. And they sent out inquisitors, basically auditors, to find out what had happened. And basically they said it was a castle and a church and a mill, probably at Millfield. And think of mills at Dover Street, mills during the medieval period, and this reference in 1333, and that has all been destroyed. So you add that to the various famines of the early 14th century, Edward Bruce coming over to Ireland in 1315 and 1318, and the Black Death in the 1340s, essentially affecting areas, nucleated settlements, the big towns. You have a rise of Gaelic lords again, and the Gaelic lords who came to power around Belfast were the clans by O'Neills. There's no reference at this stage to the church at Shankill, unfortunately, but we know that they built a castle here, and there's another map, which I haven't shown you, that shows the castle at Belfast guarding the crossing, and there's another castle, or main castle, was at Castle Ray. In terms of the place name Shankill, the earliest definite use of the place name Shankill occurs in a document of around 1552, which is very interesting. So we have that. And the fact that it's being called the Shankill, the old church, 1604, it's ruinous, suggests that basically it has been supplanted by the church in Belfast, which went on to be the Corporation Church under Arthur Chichester, and then St George's Church. And it appears like the fact that it lost its status as a parish church by the 17th century seems to bear this story out. So the third version of Belfast is created by Arthur Chichester at the end of the 9 Years' War between Hugh O'Neill and the forces of Queen Elizabeth. He's one of their victorious generals, and he's given Belfast, and he creates the new Belfast. This is our first map of Belfast, 1684 or 1685, a Thomas Phillips map. Shows the relative importance of Belfast to Carrickfergus. Carrickfergus had been mapped in 1560, 1567, 1596, and it was under its fourth map in 1685. Phillips mapped Carrickfergus as well. Belfast gets its first map 70 years after Arthur Chichester refinds it. And we did this for the tourists when we were taking people around the centre of Belfast, just to give you an idea. It had defences. There was a proviso for defences in the Corporation of Belfast in 1613. These defences were never built, and it's been suggested that Arthur Chichester, who spent very little time at Belfast, although he built a beautiful castle, you can see that there in the top right, spent most of his time in Carrickfergus, and the idea is that he was going to use Belfast as a port and used Carrickfergus as his main administrative centre. And he finished the town walls that had been started in the 16th century in Carrickfergus, and he built himself a beautiful house called Mountjoy in Carrickfergus. He built a lovely castle in the centre of Belfast, the third Belfast castle, and we know it's built side by side to the Clandy-Boy O'Neill Tower House in Belfast, because the plantation commissioners come around in 1611 and they describe the masons, Chichester's masons, taking down the castle to the vaults of the cellars, which is a first floor tower house is vaulted, and then building Chichester's brick castle beside it. So, 2 for 1, if we ever get to dig in and around Cornmarket and we find the tower house, Chichester's castle is right beside it, or we find Chichester's castle, the O'Neill castle. So that would be another one of our hotspots. But this is our first map. As it stands, the area around Shankill is undeveloped. So Belfast is quite a small town. And however, interestingly, I spent a day with Gail going around Shankill Graveyard, and the earliest gravestone that we found here is dated to May 1685. So there is a gravestone in Shankill Park, in Shankill Graveyard, that's the same date as Thomas Phillips' map, which is quite nice, so dating back to the second half of the 17th century. Chichester's Castle, lucky it got mapped in 1685, because in 1708 it burnt down, and you can see the bottom part of it here, the old gardens, some of the defences. These things are for cannon. There's only 4 of these left. There was originally about 7, and there were various gates, etc. Don't want to stray too much into the history and archaeology of Belfast, but my Clannigan's maps, and that road up here leads to essentially where the Shankill was. And yeah, so that's 1715. There's another really nice gravestone from Shankill Graveyard, dated to 1743, and you can see that they've made a typo. They didn't leave enough space for Margaret's name, so there's a wee T up there. Again, the personal touch, which is really, really nice. Not everybody's perfect. 1757, no defences left in Belfast. It's still pretty much around the 17th century core. 1791, we're starting to see the grumblings of industrial revolution, and you have places like Ropeworks, the glassworks at Ballincarrat, the Downshire pottery that was excavated and published by Peter Francis. And up here is the Shankill Road. This actually says, you can't see it, but it says Shankill Burying Ground. So basically you have Shankill here, a road up to it, a few houses, but again essentially undeveloped at this stage. Early 19th century, we have the Watchtower, and we are at the time of Burke and Hare grave robbers, shots being fired at Friars Bush, etc. So And if you've ever been to Scotland, or some of the churches I've been to, they have these huge things outside that they were put on the coffins for a few days or a few weeks so that the coffins couldn't be disturbed. But in these, you basically had relatives of recently buried people staying there, making sure that grave robbers couldn't come, steal the bodies, take them to doctors, so that the doctors would practice anatomy on them. I bring this up because I found this at an excavation at the corner of Waring Street and Hill Street, it was Cotton Court, in 2002. I was digging the back garden of a property that fronted onto Waring Street. I had a mattock, one of these things, the archaeologist's friend, along with a trowel, and I was about to dig, and my spider senses went, and I stopped and cleaned it up, and it was a skull with all these holes in it. And that's what it looked like when it was cleaned up. So you're going, it's a skull, right? What's it doing here? What are all those holes? So you know, it's about people. So what was this person doing there with holes in their head? Well, until 1832 and the Anatomy Act, it was illegal for doctors to practice on cadavers. So basically, for them to train their students, they paid people Burke Hare and the like to steal bodies. And I don't know if any of you have ever had migraine. I had it until my early 20s. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. There were weekends where I was in bed in the dark the whole time, and mother was kind of wet cloth. One of the ways of trying to release the pressure is to dig a hole. Is a trepanation or trephination is a technique that's been used from prehistoric times. They found bodies where holes have been cut with flint. Sometimes the people recover, sometimes they get infected and die, but it's basically a way of releasing pressure. The fact that I think there's 11 or 13 of these holes, and the fact that I think they stopped doing it because it started cracking, means that basically there was either one person would be doing it really badly, or there was a whole bunch of students. You try and interpret everything you find. So in the street directories around Waring Street, there's a whole bunch of doctors. Where is the nearest church? St. George's Church, which is across High Street. Why are they doing it? Because the Anatomy Act hasn't come in. What I didn't get was the callous disregard. I was digging the back garden, and this skull had been thrown away, and there was pottery and there was glass, it was in a layer. If you're trying to hide something, you dig a hole, and archaeologically you can see the size of the pit, you can see the way it's been filled in. They didn't attempt to hide the doctor, presumably didn't attempt to hide this, it was literally thrown out into the back garden, which kind of annoyed me. The other thing that I hadn't really encountered, so back in the day, we would encounter human remains quite regularly on excavations, and you have to ring the coroner, you ring the police come out and you say, this is a human remains, it's got Bronze Age pottery, we're happy that this is 3,000 years old or whatever. I was able to say to them, there's clay pipes, there's 18th and 19th century pottery. But because it was in the centre of Belfast, basically the whole Hill Street was ticker taped off, the people in their soccer masks, all were in there. I was putting the Land Rover, and it is an archaeological thing, but you can understand the sensitivities. But these are the sort of things that the people in Shankill Graveyard were kind of trying to guard against. Arches of Belfast in 1823, and you can see Shankill there. The development of the town up to the 1830s, and again, Shankill isn't on this, and this is from the very fabulous historic towns atlas of Stephen Royal and people who have published for Belfast. So Shankill still wasn't well developed by the early 1800s. However, you get the first signs of industry in the far south, and we're coming back to the rivers again. I'm nearly finished as well. First industry in the far south, so from 1834, all around the rivers, and you can see the flour mill there. Canops, bird's eye view of Belfast, as Belfast is developing shipbuilding, manufacturing, industry, and this is the Shankill Road, and you can see it's a good way. It's a good way of showing how you come out from the city over the hills. One of the possible reasons that the early churches at Shankill were located there was on a well-worn track away from the Lagan, the crossing point of the Lagan inland. That's Canops, bird's eye view just showing it, and you can see Shankill is N there. Just an idiot's guide for me, basically that this chap did. And then we have the engraving of Belfast, as Belfast is becoming this huge industrial powerhouse. And the Shankill is P, which is, let's see. So this is the Shankill, oh, this is the Shankill Road here. There we go. Here. And you can see now Shankill, the town of Belfast in the 19th century has gone from tens of thousands of people to hundreds of thousands of people. You can see the development of industry and how Belfast has expanded, how it's become this powerhouse and soaking in all the areas. Again, just show, some of it's weaving, some of it's industrial, again. But if you go then back to the historic environment map viewer, you can click off the archaeological sites and look at the industrial sites. So the industrial sites here are all, you can see how many of those, there's the Shankill Road here, and how many industrial sites are there. There were too many for me to make a list, but basically what I did was clicked on a few of them and took a screenshot. So you have corn mills, starch works, flax spinning mills, rope works, brickworks. For the hundreds of thousands of people that were living in Belfast, there was brickworks everywhere, all along the Lagan, over at Hay Park on your road as well. Lime kilns, weaving factories, etc. So this is what the information you get on the industrial heritage record. And by this stage, by around 1900 then, the Shankill was firmly enclosed, part of this industrial powerhouse that made Belfast, for a while anyway, the biggest city in Ireland. I'll leave this as my final slide. This is a map I did of excavations carried out in the centre of Belfast. Shankill isn't on it. On a bucket list at some point. I would love to get to do an excavation in the park and the graveyard and see, because almost certainly there's both a very important early Christian church and the most important medieval church at Belfast. So this is a wee bit of an overview. I hope I haven't strayed too much into Belfast archaeology as well, but putting it all in context. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Rory. That was absolutely fantastic. And now we're going to hand over to the next speaker, Sam Guthrie. Sam is an early career public historian. Sam did his master's degree at Queen's in public history. He graduated in 2021. And afterwards he worked with me on the exhibition that we're launching today, and I think you'll all agree he did an absolutely fantastic job. Before that he worked with British Library and National Museums NI on the Unlocking Our Sound project, and is currently working on two projects. One of them is the National Lottery Heritage Fund project, Stories on the Estate, a community history project on Twinbrook Estate. That sounds absolutely fascinating. And Our Stories, Our Times, an oral history project that collects recollections of the important work of the British Red Cross in Northern Ireland. Sam's going to briefly now talk to us a little bit about the work he did in the exhibition and some of the stories that came out of that. Thanks, Sam.
Well, thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be back and a pleasure to be talking about St Matthew's again. I've really enjoyed my work there, and it's every time you come back you get a chance to look at it afresh. Look, I thought I'd get the joke out of the way first. Obviously, I'm Australian. I'd like to thank the United Kingdom for making me feel very at home in the last few weeks. I too am used to many Prime Ministers. Rory, thank you for that, because that's really good, because that shows you one of the great things of this large-scale history, and now I'm going to bring it down. It also works really neatly because my slides, without even having met you before, are going to meet up just where yours have ended, essentially, particularly with using some of those PRONI map viewers and stuff as well. But what I'm going to sort of talk to you about today with the exhibition, I'm going to try not to repeat too much of what's already up there, because that's there and I don't want to do you guys out of a bit of reading. But I want to talk to you about this thing that we kept talking about as we met with the people over at St Matthew's and we started to plan this exhibition, to talk about St Matthew's as a central point, a smaller point from which everything else sort of connects and reaches out to. We sort of often use the metaphor of St Matthew's was the hub at the centre of a wheel, and there's all these spokes going off. Some of the spokes are some of the topics we looked at up there. I'm going to run through a few of these today. didn't realise I jumped. Is this on timing? Maybe it's timed. If this is timed, it's going to go quickly. I'm going to jump back to the 1870s for a little bit of a start, which is a little bit earlier than I said. But during the research and work on this, we actually uncovered some original plans that I don't believe had been seen by everyone down at St Matthew's before, which actually show that the shamrock shape of the church, which is unique in Ireland, must have been known to the people who were agreeing to this. The vestry minutes that would have had the agreements to these, they weren't kept at the time, and the vestry minutes actually do complain about the fact that they previously weren't kept. But through these documents held by the RCB Library in Dublin, it's the represented church body library down in Dublin, we do have the signatory dates. We know it was agreed in September of 1870, so then 2 years were spent building before consecrating the church. It's a great way to really kick me off there is to get my slides going like that. But I will persevere. Just to give a bit of a brief sort of introduction to the church itself, so we've got that in place. It's established by the current St Matthew's, where we go back to where St Matthew's, so where St Matthew's is today, 1872 is rededicated on the corner of the Woodvale Road and the Shankill Road. That's not the first place of St Matthew's, although it is the place of the 150-year-old St Matthew's. Prior to that, we had St Matthew's down the street, just next to the graveyard. That was St Matthew's, was established by Dr. Thomas Drew, and that was established sometime in the 1830s. He was from Christchurch, Durham Street, and this was a small sort of chapel outside of his sort of reach and research. So this is where we're going to go and talk about. Sorry, I don't understand why my slides are timed. I'm really sorry about that. Does anyone know if there's a way for me to stop that happening? It's all right. Okay. All right. So of course Dr. Thomas Drew and the Reverend, eventually of course the flock for St Matthew's grew too big for the building down next to the church, next to the graveyard. That building is still there. That's now the parochial hall. In between it became St Matthew's School, which was part of this research as well. So you can go see it today, although it doesn't look as neat as it does in the photo we have under the Leisure and Play banner. When they moved up to St Matthew's and what we now know today on the corner of Woodvale Road and the Shankill, so that was constructed at a cost of £3,000, and that was on land that was donated by William Ewart, who was the eventual first baronet William Ewart. And after he had passed, his wife continued to come to events that were held at the church along the way. So one of the things we talk about is this dramatic change that Rory was alluding to, and how you see here on the map, this is Shankill in the 1860s, and this is before and during those early period of industrialisation of Belfast, really reaching out and drawing in. You can see the Shankill as a community that's just outside of Belfast. There are some farmhouses, there are some works, and you can see just here, this is the church. This is Thomas Drew's church, the first church before it's moved. So we can see that it's already there near the graveyard. And then this is the growth. This is the first OS map I've got access to from the beginning of the 20th century. This is the growth. This is Belfast coming out and swamping what was a small village outside. And this is, I think, what a lot of people do know as the Shankill. And this is where a lot of people's stories and memories of the Shankill arise, is this more industrialised, grown-out version of the area. But what we can see is the church has survived this change. The church has continued as a central point, and this change has happened around it. And this is sort of how one small institution grows out and has these greater changes. So some of these records that St Matthew's have been digitised and are still held here at PRONI, and they were one of the first points of call to go to sort of identify elements of change. And we identify a lot of elements of change in the way that people work. And I went and did that looking through particularly marriage and baptism registries, which have been digitised. And they're a wonderful resource to see this changing, because you can see what people listed as their occupations, and you can see people listing, in one instance, the first marriage up here is quite an interesting one, because it's a widow and a widower marrying, and so we know they're a little bit older, and we can see that, so in 1898 we've got a wife coming into marriage who doesn't list an occupation. That would have been more common going back further into the past. But then by the time we're getting into the early 20th century, the marriages, women are working, men are working, they're all working in locations nearby Shankill. You're seeing jobs have gone from, say, in the late 1890s, the jobs of farmers and farm labourers have been replaced by labourers, brickmakers, people working in industry, gas lighters. A lot of women will come up as, we've got spinners and hem stitchers, and a lot of references to, of course, Brookfield Mill, which you can see in a number of photos behind St Matthew's. That was also owned by the Ewarts originally, so that was their mill, and that's one of the places that was really connected into this work. And through some of these records, we also trace people as they left the parish and moved around Belfast. It was introducing a movement of people, so people weren't always just staying in the Shankill as well. Through some of the further records, we then looked at how the church played a role in both. It's hard to sort of class this. I've sort of written here in my notes, it's both how it played a role in some of the political part of people's lives, as well as the historic part. So looking at that time during, of course, World War I, and then the 1920s, the early Troubles. This is actually from the preacher's books, and this is Reverend Robert Walker. He's writing in 1921. He's referencing in July of 1921 shooting and disturbances in Belfast. Something he had to do a number of times during his period there. He was one who actually noted in the preacher's books a lot of things that went on, including in better times. He was noting weather. He actually spent a lot of time just noting down it had snowed, it was nice and stuff as well. So these are still held by St Matthew's. And they're another wonderful resource for jumping in and seeing stuff. But of course, the First World War and the Shankill Road, these are two topics that come together a fair bit and have been covered. At the time, St Matthew's, of course, played a key role in this. The Reverend Josiah Shearman was a reverend at the time, and he preached strongly in favour of the men who joined, the men who signed up. A lot of his more political and his more sort of opinionated preaching and stuff appear in the parish magazines as well. He played a role in talking about home rule, his opposition to home rule. And these were the things that were going out, and they were every day for all the members, all the parishioners, that people would be having access to these and understanding this sort of worldview. So it's a way of viewing how the church was interacting with people's external views, their political views and their thoughts as they went along. But he passed away during the First World War, was replaced by the Reverend Robert Walker. Reverend Robert Walker's own son, Second Lieutenant Claude Walker, died in July 1916 at the war. Of course, it was about 800 men, we believe, from the parish went to serve, and they are remembered on the font at the pulpit at the front of St Matthew's today. The church itself, of course, was touched again by war in the 1940s and 1941, and the night of 16 April, during one of the runnings of the Blitz, an incendiary device came through the roof in St Matthew's and started a fire, but across the road, the Methodist minister saw the fire was starting and managed to come round to have the fire put out, which has made sure that St Matthew's is still standing today. So St Matthew's also played a really key role at the middle of people's social lives, their leisure life, the life that they led around the Shankill as well. It wasn't just, say, these political sort of viewpoints and stuff, but that's an interesting way to look at it. And it wasn't just religion. It was such a key part of everyone's life in the community to come to actually get their social life and their leisure time. Through the parish magazines again, it's a wonderful resource. We can see that not only were they running, you can see down here in the right-hand corner, the Little Girls Club. There was the Little Girls Club, there was the Boys Brigade, there was the Girls Friendly Society, there was a number of many annual bazaars, sales of wares. Often these were visited by important Belfast dignitaries. The Lady Dixon came to many of these. Lady Hewitt was coming along to these as well. These were busily taking up space. So when St Matthew's had moved up further up the hills where we know it today, the old building that had become this church school was now being used for these bazaars and these events. So there was a lot going on. It was a very busy calendar of life. We can see sporting clubs. I mean, there's a badminton club. There was later on there's a football team. We can see as well jumble sales, so bazaars. These sort of events were going on. And of course, they were taking kids out to get out to other parts of the Northern Ireland. They were taking kids to Strangford Lough and down to Whitehead. So they were getting out and seeing that part of the world. It's also for many people living and growing up in Shankill at the time, in the early 20th century, you would have been living and growing up in what would be slums. And so it was an opportunity to get out of industrialised and polluted Belfast to greener pastures. And these are really given wonderful reviews in the parish magazines. They're really shedding light on what people were up to, what they were enjoying at the time. I also adore all the adverts come through in all of these. It's incredible to think and see all these adverts, particularly because these adverts touch on not just the mill work and the industrial work of the Shankill, but the commerce and the village nature. So everything that you need was on the Shankill. There are ads for, there's ads for bread, there's ads for tailors, there's ads for bicycle shops, everything that you could want on the Shankill. That would be a wonderful project for the future of this sort of thing, would be to go and actually map that out again. But then, of course, I might need to make sure this doesn't click further. The Shankill's still a changing space, and that's still something that St Matthew's is at the centre of. Post-War II today, the population of Shankill has decreased from somewhere around 80,000 people down below 30,000. It'd be hard to say where it is at today, but we'll wait and see what the next census is. One of the things that as it's gone on, there's of course been the planning problems that have made things change in the community and made people planning things that were introduced by Belfast have impacted Shankill in some ways that have been negative. The initial establishment of the Weetabix houses and the attempt at the Belfast urban motorway, things that really went to the core of the community that wanted to remain. And Jackie's not in the room at the moment, but to say that Shankill efforts from the 1970s and on to today have been really key to maintaining what Shankill has and restoring parts of that as well. Of course, St Matthew's itself has been touched by the troubles that, of course, you would be want not to say. But in 1972, the bombing of the Wood Arms Hotel actually damaged the church quite severely, and it took over a year until it was reopened and rededicated. But at the time, the Beltel did report that it was the church that refused to quit, I think, which is a good way to put it. And as part of our project, on the day of actually having this exhibition opened up at St Matthew's, we were keen to have people from the community to come in as a part of a history harvest to bring their wares and their objects along for us to take photos of, to digitise and to record their memories. And so, as I sort of said, St Matthew's itself is still at the centre of a changing world, a new changing sort of Shankill. We think even going forward that we can use it and use these sort of stories as a centre point to talk about what has changed since. You'll notice I haven't talked too much about post-World War II, just to cover, but because we're actually getting this stuff now, we're talking to people and getting these memories. And these are sort of some of the wonderful examples of stuff that people brought today. Of course, we've got a copy of a ticket, the last ever tram from the Shankill, a photo of workers at Shorts, a postcard with St Matthew's on it. We've got I really enjoyed, I hadn't seen these before, lots of photos of all the community members from different streets on VE Day. These were quite common, a lot of people brought a number of these in, we could get copies of. And here's Home Guard identity papers as well. So this is just some of the stuff that we collected, and hopefully going forward we'll collect more on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sam. That was brilliant. It really took me back to all the fantastic work being done around St Matthew's for the anniversary. So I'm just going to wind up now very briefly and say as I did at the beginning that this really marks the start rather than the end of a project, something that myself and my colleagues at Queen's have been working on in close partnership with the Greater Shankill Partnership, to look at ways in which we can develop greater awareness of and engagement with the history of the area. It's something we want to do, and we want to do it in partnership with the people themselves, working in ways that engage and empower people at a local level to collect and to tell their stories. So together with colleagues in archaeology, we'll be working with the local community in the Shankill area, and archaeologists have got exciting plans that will involve digging around in graveyards, you'd be pleased to hear, Rory, and other interesting places. And we historians are going to be working alongside them, collecting the stories of people, how they lived, their memories of the past, building an oral history collection relating to life on the Shankill. Why is this important? It's important in 3 ways, very, very quickly. First of all, these stories need to be collected. Jackie pointed out earlier, the tragic news from today is just such a point to stop and say this is so important. These stories must be collected. When you look at the history books, if you go into any bookshop and you look at who the history books, who are they about? They're about great men, they're always about men. The rulers, the governors, they're about battles from long ago. Where are the stories of the ordinary people? Those are the stories we need to hear. Those are the stories that are important and need to be collected. So that's one of the real drivers behind what we're doing here today. Second of all, it's this kind of social history, the history of everyday life, that has a power to unite communities. We're too familiar in Northern Ireland with the way in which history is used to divide people. It's a history of them and us. It's a history of who's in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't. And again, in an Irish context, too much of our history has been about revolutions and about wars, about victors and about battles. But the reality is that through all these wars and conflicts and divisions and partitions and the erection of peace walls in more recent times, and through all the times of peaceful existence that again doesn't make it to the history books, ordinary people of whatever political colour and whatever religion and none, they just got on with their daily life. And that daily life, regardless of your political background, is just so important. People had struggles and small victories, they faced hardships, and they showed ingenuity and resilience in how they got on with their lives. And those are the stories that we need to connect, because those are the shared spaces that unite the people of our country today. And finally, history's good for you. It's good for individuals, it's good for communities. One of the key areas that I'm interested in researching is the close connection that I believe exists between doing history at a local level with your community and well-being and health. It's particularly important in the context of Northern Ireland. We've seen the impact of the conflict, especially in young people. We've seen the impact of COVID and the isolation that young people have experienced over the past few years, and the impact of that on well-being, in particular mental health. So I believe that people in general are becoming more isolated, more cut off, and this is having a real impact on people's well-being. So bringing people together, young people and old people and everyone in between, to explore the history of their area and to tell the history of their area to other people is a really, really important thing that we should be involved in. And therefore, I am so excited for what lies ahead, for the collaboration with PRONI and the people of the Shankill in collecting our stories and making sure that those stories are told for generations to come. So thank you very much for being here today.